Okay, so today we're going to be doing a podcast on Wuthering Heights. My name is Justine Pizzo, and I'm a lecturer at English at the University of Southampton. I specialize in Victorian literature, and I'm here today with Sarah. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Float. I am a third-year English student at the University of Southampton, and I went to secondary school at Chipping Sodbury, which is more west.
More west than Southampton.
Yeah.
I did not go to secondary school in the UK, as you may be able to tell from my accent on this podcast. But Sarah's here today to kind of talk with me a bit about her experience doing Wuthering Heights at A level. And she may have mentioned she's a finalist now at Southampton, so she's in her third year. So we're going to start by giving just a kind of brief synopsis of Wuthering Heights, which is a rather complex novel and, of course, spans a rather sort of long period of time and goes back and forth within time, so not a sort of straightforward linear narrative, which may make a synopsis less than straightforward. But I think if we had to describe what Wuthering Heights is about, we might say that on the surface, it's a story about love and revenge, and we'll talk more about that later on. It basically covers two generations of marriages between two families, as those of you currently studying it will know. The family that resides at Wuthering Heights, the Earnshaws, and of course their sort of adopted son Heathcliff, who's been brought back from the father's business trip to Liverpool, and the family home at Thrushcross Grange, right, where the Lintons live. Of course, it's a passionate and spiritual, as well as physical, intensely physical at sometimes, love story between Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff. And we'll talk more today. I think Sarah and I are both interested in the ways in which this may adhere to, but also possibly disrupt conventional ideas about romance and its sort of status as a love story. But it also is a novel that deals very much with nature and the environment. So for those of us reading it now, we'll know that the moorland environment, the sort of very rough landscape of the West Riding in Yorkshire, where both Emily Brontë and her sisters were from, has a big effect on the characters and the way that they relate to one another. So hopefully we'll touch on that later in the podcast as well. So after that brief overview of Wuthering Heights, we thought it would be useful for Sarah to talk a little bit about her own experience doing A-levels, what she studied, what text she looked at, and so she's going to just sort of go over that part of her educational history, even though it's now 4 years ago. She took a gap year. So.
That's very scary. Right. So I was very much all about English at A-level. I did English literature and English language separately. I know that's not the case for everyone, but that's what I did. And I actually read Wuthering Heights less as a set text on my particular course and more as sort of wider reading to inform the kind of essays that I was hoping to write for that course across AS and A2. And yeah, my set text was actually Jane Eyre, so another Brontë novel by different sister, which was interesting to read alongside it.
Absolutely. And for those of you preparing Jane Eyre, we're also going to talk a little bit about that today, just because it's in some ways absolutely relevant to the ways in which we understand Wuthering Heights and its history and context as well. Okay, so maybe we could think a little bit then about the historical context of Wuthering Heights and the ways in which it's often placed in dialogue with Jane Eyre. Bronte's position within the literary marketplace was definitely one that evolved over what we might consider a quite short period of time. So Wuthering Heights is quite famously Emily Bronte's first and only novel, and it was written when she was in her late 20s. But previously, the sisters, the Brontë sisters, so that would have been Charlotte, Emily, and of course their sister Anne, who wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and of course Agnes Grey, which was actually published alongside Wuthering Heights. I don't know if some people may not know that. It was initially published in 3 volumes, which Wuthering Heights was part of, and then Agnes Grey was combined with it. So prior to this publication of Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, in which Anne and Emily published together, the three sisters collectively had published a volume of poems. So in 1846, Emily, Anne, and Charlotte published the poems of Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. And of course, you remember their acronyms. Did you learn about that at A-level?
Yeah, I remember we looked at that and kind of their early life we looked at a little bit. And yeah, just the fact that they had to publish under pseudonyms was part of our background.
Absolutely, very relevant. So in Charlotte Brontë, the eldest sister, is later writing about Wuthering Heights. She does discuss their decision to adopt these pseudonyms, which are presumably masculine but also somewhat gender ambiguous, which Charlotte Brontë notes that they didn't want to immediately presume a male pseudonym, but they also wanted to obscure the fact that they were women. So this is important for thinking, too, about the kinds of personas that each of these three sisters assumes in writing the novels they write. And we might also note, as we'll discuss in just a moment, that even though Emily was writing under the pseudonym Ellis, her novel was not protected from critiques of its quote-unquote rudeness or sort of profanity. So even though it was written under a non-gender specific pseudonym or even a male or masculine pseudonym, it was still taken to task for its manners, which we'll talk about more in a moment. Okay, so the poems were published in 1846 by Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. And then shortly thereafter, Jane Eyre appeared. So in October 1847, Jane Eyre was published by Charlotte Brontë and was pretty immediately a success. People were quite receptive to it, and although it did receive some harsh reviews, it was generally a successful novel and was published in multiple editions. Wuthering Heights met with a little bit more reserve in its critical reception, as did Agnes Grey. And again, it was published the same year as Jane Eyre. So quite soon after Jane Eyre, we see Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey appear in print in December of 1847. But no one knew at that point who the Brontes were. So they were still pseudonymous. And in fact, the first disclosure of their true identity was in the summer of 1848, when Charlotte Brontë and Anne Brontë, without Emily, which we'll discuss in a minute, went to London to announce their identities to Charlotte Bronte's editors. So people in the press had been accusing, or not accusing, but suggesting that Agnes Grey and Wuthering Heights were less mature, less sophisticated, and successful productions by the author of Jane Eyre. So assuming that all of these novels were produced by quote-unquote Currer Bell. When they go to see Charlotte Bronte's publisher, Emily stays at home. And this is often discussed as part of her personality, that she wasn't very adventurous in terms of her physical travel, that she preferred to stay closer to home, even though she had in fact lived in Belgium with Charlotte Brontë for a while. So it wasn't that she never left the moors, but she did have perhaps a slightly more reserved personality than either of the other sisters, who did take it upon themselves to go to London and announce their true identities to the publisher Smith & Williams. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background in terms of the family and the literary history that led to the publication of these three novels in 1847, Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey, and Wuthering Heights, which we're discussing today. Now, I said earlier that people thought the novel was a bit rude. Were you surprised when you read it? Sarah, did you think it was a bit crass?
I mean, not by our standards, I don't feel, but you can certainly see, especially where it's there are sections from the point of view of sort of several lower class characters. And
Joseph,
you can see why people at the time might have read it and thought, oh, really?
Right. The regional dialogue was an issue for many contemporary readers, certainly. And that's, as we said, the sort of servant who attends to the Earnshaw household, Joseph, is the most sort of representative of a Yorkshire dialect. But we also have real violence in the novel. And I was struck again reading it recently.
Yeah, I was doing the same thing. And it's quite shocking in that sense. Like maybe I was less I was less shocked by some of the sort of verbal stuff, but certainly the descriptions of, like you say, physical violence can be quite, can take you aback quite a bit.
Absolutely. I mean, we have, sort of a knife being presented to Nellie Dean, one of the narrators of this novel, sort of a knife being put in her mouth. It's very shocking. The initial scene, which is often discussed as supernatural, in which the waif-like ghost of Catherine as a child comes to the window, right, and Lockwood imagines sort of dragging her wrist back and forth over the broken glass. It's very shocking, I think, that the ways in which the body meets with very direct physical violence in this text. All of which is to say that reading it as two people who study literature and as adults, I think that's still adults in the 21st century, it definitely strikes us as shocking, even though it's very powerful, this depiction of violence and the ways in which people react to each other physically in the novel. Contemporary readers were no different. They also felt that some of the things in the novel were, quote, too coarse and disagreeable to be attractive, as one reviewer put it in The Spectator in 1847. He also said, this anonymous reviewer, that the incidents have a, quote, moral taint about them. Okay, so definitely aware of the sort of moral transgressions, not only perhaps in Catherine being in love with Heathcliff while she's married to Linton, or to Edgar Linton rather, but also in just the ways in which some of the language in the book, not only Joseph's sort of rural speech, but also in fact the curse words, which are not blanked out, and many Victorian novels would have had an initial letter and then a dash, right? And in this novel we get the full sort of curses, damn you, etc. Another reviewer, just to give more of a contextual picture, said that, quote, it is not without evidences of considerable power, but as a whole it is wild, confused, disjointed, and improbable. So we're going to kind of take up some of these critiques as a way of thinking about what we think when we read Wuthering Heights, and how we might use some of these contemporary critiques in the Victorian age to create a dialogue with our readings today. Okay, so to move along a little bit, I wonder if we could think a little bit about how this novel might be put in dialogue with Jane Eyre, or with some of the differences between Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. Based on your memory of that novel and the fact that you prepared it for A-level, do you think you could remember or say a little bit about those differences, Sarah?
Yeah, I remember... I mean, obviously, Jane Eyre is considerably longer for a start.
Yes.
And it's definitely got more of a linear narrative. Wuthering Heights jumps about in time. There's several characters, all with their own points of view. Jane Eyre is very much Jane from childhood to adulthood, and it's kind of your traditional Bildungsroman, the coming-of-age story. She kind of learns and grows and lives kind of happily ever after. You don't get any of that in Wuthering Heights.
No.
Nobody grows as a person, really. And, there's certainly not very many happily ever afters.
Not really. I mean, if we think about it, sort of thinking about these aspects that might have shocked contemporary Victorian readers, right? I mean, if we were to think about happy endings in the novel, perhaps Heathcliff's death, where he sort of, in the end, dies quite suddenly and of natural causes, and presumably gets to be with Catherine as he has desired all along, is perhaps the most we could say of a happy ending. But it's also a quite ghoulish ending, and his eyes sort of staring up at the ceiling, and sort of found in the enclosed bed in the upper bedroom where he used to hide with the young Catherine. So we get this sense maybe Heathcliff has a happy ending in his death. But yes, there's not a lot of progression or development as the characters grow from young to old. We might have said, is there one exception to that, maybe? Or does anyone sort of get...
Yeah, I mean, we could think about the younger generation as perhaps starting to break that mold, which is a relief. Mm-hmm. The idea that maybe they won't turn out quite as bad as their parents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hareton and Cathy, of course, end up falling in love at the end after Cathy the Younger has had an unsuccessful marriage to Heathcliff's son, Linton, right, his son with Isabella. And of course they do, she teaches Hareton to read, and they do, in the end, sort of grow to plan a marriage in the new year at the end of the novel. So there's this idea that they will become, as you say, Sarah, sort of the next generation to kind of maybe have a potentially happy future and leave behind the kinds of moral, I don't know if we want to call it moral solipsism or sort of moral greed of maybe, I don't know if moral greed is a word, but the sort of, I don't know, maybe the selfishness of Cathy the Elder and of Heathcliff and sort of wanting their love to be the thing that they pursue above all else, damn everyone else, and come what may. I don't know, did you, in an excellent introduction to the Oxford edition by Helen Small, she talks a little bit about the lack of morality in this novel, sort of the fact that Emily Brontë doesn't seem to concern herself with moral rights and wrongs. Do you want to say a little bit more about how that relates to Jane Eyre, just thinking about it as a Bildungsroman, and how Jane Eyre is sort of moving towards the growth of the protagonist Jane, whereas nobody makes any movement in Wuthering Heights?
Yeah, it's interesting. We spent a lot of time on Jane's childhood when we read that novel, and kind of how her experiences then influenced quite heavily her sort of attitude to life and love as she grew up, and it seems to have had like a positive influence on her character, whereas I suppose you could argue that the influence of the childhoods of a lot of the characters in Wuthering Heights kind of shaped them in much more, I guess,
negative ways?
Yeah. We don't like the word negative, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously Jane, if we think about maybe even just the contrast between a character like Catherine and a character like Jane, of course Jane really stands her moral ground with Rochester, even though she loves him, right? She refuses to be an adulteress, refuses to leave for the continent with him, as he sort of proposes at one point to escape.
She has sort of certain beliefs and morals that she sticks to.
Absolutely.
And a lot of the characters in Wuthering Heights don't seem to be moral at all. They kind of they change like the wind.
Exactly.
They really do.
Exactly. Which brings us to the title of the novel, which did you study at all when you read it what the title means, The Wuthering?
I was probably one of those children before I read it who initially thought it was like withering.
Yeah.
I thought it was just withering spelled wrong.
Yeah.
But I think I might have read somewhere that it was to do with the wind blowing and like sounds or something like that. It's
absolutely, yeah. I think the quote in the novel is something along the lines of it's a significant provincial adjective that relates to certain stations of the heath or in nature in atmospheric tumult. So it's this kind of even in the title, we get this sense that, yes, the wind is blowing quite vigorously, quite sort of violently, and that these characters in the context of their natural... More violence.
Yeah, even the wind is violent in this book.
Indeed. But yeah, so I guess just thinking about ways in which, if one were preparing this for an A-level and thinking about wider reading, that we might put it in dialogue with Jane Eyre, thinking about sort of Jane's moral growth, as Sarah was saying, her early childhood experiences, especially with Helen, her playmate at school, in which she is sort of taught this very sort of altruistic moral code, but also, and sort of adheres to it and also develops over the course of the novel to stand her moral ground, of course, with Rochester and not become a bigamist. We have a very different sort of scenario in Wuthering Heights in which Cathy and Heathcliff's love for one another seems to shut out all other sort of moral scenarios or concerns. And of course for Heathcliff, his love becomes something of an obsession or a sort of revenge narrative after Cathy dies. Okay, so thinking what else we should discuss here, I wonder if in your A-level reading, or even as you've read in university, are there other texts that we might productively put in dialogue with Wuthering Heights to think about passion or romance, or even some of the class dynamics that we could address further in the novel?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many plays and novels that you could, especially if you're focusing on the sort of romance, jealousy side of things. There's so many that you could talk about with that. I remember when I was reading this, I looked at Notes on a Scandal by Zoe Heller. That was a novel that had a lot of sort of covetousness and possessive relationships, not necessarily of a romantic nature, but just in general it was an interesting similarity. Obviously you've got Othello, all about jealousy.
Absolutely, yeah. Also quite violent, actually,
yeah,
if you think about it.
Yeah, especially, you know, Desdemona and her death and things like that. Or I suppose if you did want to look at the class dynamics more, which wasn't something that I was able to do at A-level, actually. But I remember we read a J.M. Barrie play, slightly more obscure. It was called The Admirable Crichton, and that was heavily commenting on class dynamics and that sort of thing, and it was really interesting.
What happens in that play?
It's basically a story about an upper class family and their butler, and somewhere along the line, I think they get shipwrecked. And on this desert island where surviving is important and you have to have a level head, the whole class system gets kind of inverted, and the butler becomes the sort of most important,
that's interesting,
higher class social.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if we could put that in dialogue too with the ways in which the outsider in this novel, who becomes the most successful sort of owner of both estates, right, of Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights, is of course Heathcliff. Initially an orphan of unknown sort of ethnic descent. Sometimes he's called a gypsy or a lascar. We don't really know how he's ended up on the streets of Liverpool. Some criticism suggests that he is meant to be Irish, that the emigration of Irish people to Liverpool during this time might connect to the description of Heathcliff and his sort of starving state when he's found on the streets by the Earnshaw patriarch and brought home to Wuthering Heights. But I think like the fact that Heathcliff is the sort of outsider who becomes the dominant one, right? Initially an orphan and of no class status, but able to manipulate things, obtain an education of unknown origins. We don't really know what happens to him during his 3-year absence. Suggests a similar kind of flipping, maybe, that he's dominant in the same way that the play you're discussing might. And
of course, Jane in Jane Eyre kind of transcends class as well. Obviously, she comes into a large amount of money, which helps.
Of course,
but she kind of goes from orphan to governess to lady.
Exactly.
Of whatever, I can't remember the name of her house that she has with Rochester at the end, but.
Yes.
That place.
Yes. Yeah, in the forest. It'll come to me. But yeah, so it's important to think about these connections, I think. And maybe even to think a little bit about the genre of Wuthering Heights and the way it uses formal techniques like nested narration, sort of stories within stories, to create different class dynamics, right? The sort of the narrator of the frame tale, Lockwood, is a sort of often, I think, comically so, a kind of upper-class gentleman who doesn't quite know what to make of the inhabitants of the heath, and of course is unable to find his way through the natural elements.
He relies very much on the locals who know the landscape to get from one place to the other.
Absolutely. So he, even though he is sort of the frame narrator, I think often his perspective on events shows the sort of distance or his inability in some ways to understand the communications between the two families and between the characters that Nellie Dean sort of brings to life in her recounting of Heathcliff and Catherine's love story and the story of the generations of their families. Okay, so thinking about genre too, obviously for those reading it for A-level, we'll probably be thinking already about the mix of sort of romantic or romanticism in the novel and in the way in which it sort of holds Heathcliff up as a kind of Byronic hero or sort of romantic hero, only then to refuse that reading, right? To say, no, he's actually very violent, as Catherine does when she warns Isabella Linton not to marry him.
I think there's several characters, aren't there? Lockwood and Nellie as well talk about how when they first meet him, they think he seems quite
distinguished.
Yeah, and then but over time, he's kind of proven to be absolutely not what he seems.
Exactly.
Quite brutish.
And at times compared to the devil as well. He gets compared to Satan. So there is this way in which, even though it seems to be romantic and setting up sort of storylines along the lines of maybe Shelley or Walter Scott, who the Brontes read avidly, it does ultimately, I think, deny that narrative, not wanting to cast Heathcliff in a singularly heroic, sort of romantic or heroic light. Also, it has elements of the Gothic. Did you study the Gothic at all when you were in A-level?
Unfortunately, not. I was always really, really sad that we didn't do that. So many of my fellow English students talk about how they studied novels like Frankenstein and Dracula and things like that, very, very strongly rooted in the Gothic. We
Victorian novels that go back to an 18th century Gothic.
We touched on it with Jane Eyre and the Red Room and things like that. And the idea of the Mad Woman in the Attic. That was kind of where we discussed the Gothic. But I think it's really important to remember it with Bronte novels.
Definitely. I mean, I also think maybe the best way to connect that, if we think about Bertha Mason and Jane Eyre imprisoned in the Red Room, and then we think about the younger Catherine, who is basically abducted by Heathcliff and Heathcliff's son Linton, right, and sort of imprisoned at Wuthering Heights, basically against her will and forced to marry Heathcliff's son. It's very much indebted to a kind of Gothic trope of imprisonment, women sort of tucked away in castles, in the mountains in Italy. If you're reading a Radcliffe novel or an 18th century, Gothic fiction, like The Castle of Otranto or something, this is a very time-honored Gothic trope, right? This sort of woman locked away, held against her will, and Bronte is definitely playing with that. I think Emily Brontë is definitely playing with that in Wuthering Heights, as is, of course, Charlotte, as Sarah said in Jane Eyre. So another connection you might draw between the two novels. Okay, so let's see. For thinking about our listeners and what might be useful for A-level prep, I was wondering if you wanted to say just a bit more, Sarah, about the ways in which you were taught to read this as a romantic text and whether or not that's been problematized for you as a more advanced student in your third level at Southampton?
Yeah, I mean, I always found it quite narrow to just think of it as a romantic novel. I went into it with the expectation that it was, one of the greatest romances of all time, and that I kind of was expecting to root for these people to be together. And by the end of it, I absolutely was not. I was like, how could anyone... It's been something that I've thought of quite a lot since I did it. And yeah, sort of over the years, the more I think about it, the more I realise how it kind of not tainted the reading experience, but it certainly coloured it in a certain way as to make me almost reluctant to pick it up again. And I remember rereading it for this podcast and being pleasantly surprised by how much more I enjoyed it sort of a second time round. And I think part of that was because I appreciated much more the sort of language and the sort of the way that the narrative sort of makes use of flashbacks and different points of view and all that kind of stuff with the craft of the novel, as opposed to just the plot and the idea of it being a story about these two people who are wildly in love, but are very, in a way, they deserve each other. Yeah. But they're also it's a very toxic relationship.
It is. As we see through the ill effects it has on other people around them and on different generations of the family, I guess until we get to that sort of happier ending with Hareton and the younger Catherine, as we discussed earlier. I guess maybe another thing to note, just very briefly, is the fact that what you're saying, Sarah, also may have to do with the fact that this is not just simply a novel indebted to early 19th century tropes of romanticism, sort of Byron, Scott, and other romantic writers, but is also really a work of the Victorian era in which realism is coming to be, and novelists are thinking a lot more about not just moral idealism and sort of romance in a sentimental way, but also thinking about characters as complex people who have very specific faults, very specific class backgrounds, very specific ways of speaking and thinking, and that maybe is part of its hybridity. So we're encouraging you to think about it not only as a romance. A couple other things we might suggest for you if you're looking for critical essays on Wuthering Heights to supplement your reading or to incorporate in an essay on the novel are recent essays by a critic named Joseph Carroll from 2008. He wrote a really interesting article called The Cuckoo's History, Human Nature in Wuthering Heights. And this deals with natural science and the ways in which this novel is dealing with not just romance, but also scientific discoveries, and might be put in dialogue with the writings of Charles Darwin. So that's an interesting thing to check out if you want more secondary criticism. Another thing we could suggest would be an essay by the critic Marianne Thormelin, who writes on, quote, Christian ethics in Wuthering Heights. And this is an essay from 2014 that might help you think in a different way about some of the religious dialogue in the novel and whether it is a sort of what many critics at the time saw as a blasphemous text, or whether this is thinking about Christian ethics in a different way. So you might want to check that out. A final word on this is, for those looking for supplementary reading, the Oxford World's Classics edition of the novel, as well as the Norton Critical Edition, have lots of supplementary materials. Did you use any apparatus when you were doing A-levels, like Goodreads or anything, or did you look at study guides?
Yeah, I think I might have looked at. I know I had a Penguin English Library edition or something that had quite a good section. I think I forget the word. Section at the beginning.
Yeah.
With just commenting about it, but it's always, regardless of the text, it's always useful to have a copy that has
good critical edition. A lot of these have appendices. So yeah, exactly. So one thing we can suggest if you're looking for supplementary reading is also to look at either the Norton or the Penguin or the Oxford, any edition that might have a bibliography or suggestions for further reading, which will have critical essays as well as often supplementary materials by the authors themselves, in this case sometimes poems by Emily Brontë, which might be useful to put in dialogue with her fiction writing as well. I was just wondering, in this final portion of the podcast, Sarah, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the ways in which you work with critics at university, or the ways in which you incorporate criticism in your essay writing, or any tips for students who might want to do so in an exam.
So I have actually found that, for the most part, the tips that I was given at A-level have kind of carried through university. I've expanded upon them. I've learned new things on top of it, but fundamentally I've always been taught to make a point, give evidence, and then provide an explanation for what you've just written. I also like to think of it as kind of saying what your extract, what it says, what that means, and kind of from there make your own points about what it adds to your text. I think it's important. One of the things that we're always taught at university is to not just put something from a critic into your work without having it specifically say something about what you're writing. Yeah. It's important that your voice is the main one, and that the critic, you're not just saying, oh, this critic said this, that's exactly what I'm thinking.
Right.
It's got to inform your own writing.
It's a dialogue, definitely, with these other critics. That's very helpful. If you had to write on Wuthering Heights today, are there any themes, or could you think of an essay title or topic that you might want to address in your sort of in your infinite wisdom now as a third year university student?
I'm not sure about infinite. I just think I just really, really believe that thinking about it solely as a romance is very limiting. It put me, when I was reading it, it put me in such a box. I feel like I really would have enjoyed maybe writing an essay on the way that nature is used in the book, or even the class divide that you talked about. I was never even aware of that at A level, and it's just so interesting to think about it in those ways.
I agree. I mean, I think even those things speak to one another as well, Sarah. I think we could think about the way in which the houses are even positioned, right? The Earnshaw's house being, Wuthering Heights, that is, being exposed to very, very rough weather because of its position on the moors, right? And the Linton's house, Thrushcross Grange, of course, they're of a more upper middle class background, more quote unquote refined than the Earnshaws, and their home is in a more calm climate. Even in this sort of West Riding of Yorkshire, there are different microclimates, so to speak, and different class divisions that those natural environments seem to speak to. So I think that would make a great essay topic.
I mean, the landscapes and the buildings, they really do seem to have their own personalities almost.
So true.
And that how that influences the characters is really interesting.
I think it's Wuthering Heights, right, that has the more Gothic facade. It has, I think gargoyles, or Lockwood notices when he's entering that it looks very sort of ancient and made out of stone, a very different kind of building than the Thrushcross with sort of crystal chandeliers that the young children notice when they first go, before Kathy's attacked by a dog. Which I actually would say, just on a very quick note, if I were writing an essay, I would write about animals in this text. I think it's absolutely fascinating, the way people are sort of described often as animals, or that animals sort of come in and out of the text in very prominent ways. Of course, Lockwood very sort of grotesquely mistakes a basket of dead rabbits for the younger Catherine's pet cat at the beginning of the novel, which is very Wuthering Heights. Okay, great. So just to conclude, Sarah, if you had to give our listeners one piece of advice about writing on Wuthering Heights for the A-levels, what would it be?
You know what? I think what I would have liked to hear is just, I would have liked to tell myself not to be intimidated by its reputation. I think if you're going to write about it, there's so much to talk about. You don't have to worry about everyone that's written on it before. You just have to pick one thing and go for it. You don't need to think about that reputation it has as the greatest romance of all time. You can just you can just discard that. You don't need that weighing on you.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice indeed. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening, and thank you, Sarah, for coming by my office for this chat and for biscuits and tea today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
All right, thanks a lot.